Some Arabs think that the problem lies in President Saddam of the Iraqi regime. But we all know this is not the issue. We all know what masks have been used. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad.
Welcome back to Inside Iraq. We are discussing how the Arab countries can help stabilize Iraq with 3 senior Arab diplomats. Before the break, Hisham, I asked you about this new expanded role for the United Nations. As we speak right now, the Security Council is voting on a resolution to expand the role of the United Nations. How do you view this? Is this an admission by the Americans that they have failed in Iraq and they are looking for a political coverage, or really they need the expertise of the United Nations?
Let me, before answering this question, maybe comment on what Dr. Faisal Miqdad said about the division in the Arab world, about the situation in Iraq before the war. You know, there were all kinds of divisions. This was not limited to the Arab world. Europe was also divided. And divisions were not limited also to situations between countries, but even within countries, there were all kinds of divisions as to the situation in Iraq. But the common denominator, the lowest common denominator that we were able to reach in the Arab world, I think was enough to allow us to work with the Iraqis, to work towards national reconciliation and towards to achieve other objectives. So the situation is somewhat much more complicated. But let me also move to the question that you asked about the United Nations. The role of the United Nations is always welcome, and the United Nations was even more active earlier on in Iraq compared to what we see today. But we have seen a terrorist attack on the United Nations that led to the death of almost 100 people from the United Nations. And the question is not that the United Nations was reluctant to do its role. No, the United Nations was always ready to do its role, but it was prevented from doing so. And the situation in Iraq does not allow whether the United Nations or the Arab League or many other organizations to do the role that they are expected to do in these situations.
I would like to continue what Hisham started with. In fact, at that time when Sergio de Mello was killed, I was a president of the Security Council, and we were discussing all the time whether the United Nations has a role to play in the developments in Iraq, and we were prevented from doing that by the United States. In fact, the United States at that time was against any role to be played by the United Nations. However, we think any role of the United Nations could be positive, but this role has to be independent. The United Nations should not be used by the United States to promote its objectives in Iraq. The major success that could be made is to give the United Nations a credibility and to play its role independently. Otherwise, any new resolution added to the other resolutions will not be leading the Iraqi people into a new era of peace and stability.
There is a telltale sign, Dr. Nabil, in this belated American awareness about the validity and the importance of the United Nations. If the chaos and the quagmire of Iraq is not there, we would not see a request for the UN to be involved, would we?
No, I agree with you. I think it is partly an admission of failure. I think the Bush administration is trying 2 strategies. One, to act as if it has accepted the Baker-Hamilton proposals of opening negotiations and seeking other ways, but on the other, a policy that's still hawkish enough that is causing all the destruction that we're seeing in Iraq. Part, I think, of that double policy is resort to the United Nations. Probably in the future, the United States might even more have a new appeal to the neighboring countries, the Arab countries, Iran and Turkey, to intervene. It is all an admission of failure. The American invasion has failed. And as a result of its failure, the agony of Iraq has multiplied, the destruction has multiplied, and the agony has spread all around the Arab world and the Middle East. The Republicans were defeated in the elections, and they are now facing a new presidential elections where I'm sure will be defeated. The question, therefore, is anybody who would consider that the Americans have succeeded is really not seeing the reality. The question of going to the United Nations and hopefully really to the Arab League, where I think the Arab League should be ready to handle a much bigger role, should be a real alternative, yes, and not only a cover-up.
The Iraqi government, Dr. Faisal, keep asking for the Arab governments to open their embassies back again. The Saudi Foreign Minister, Al-Amir Saud al-Faisal, agreed last week to send a delegation to Baghdad with a view of opening their Saudi embassies. The Iraqi government keeps saying that will help us a lot. From your diplomatic experience, what would opening embassies in Iraq do to the Iraqi government? And we saw how the Egyptian ambassador was killed in Baghdad.
In fact, we as Syria have opened our embassy a long time ago, 1 year after the invasion. We think embassies will activate the channels of communication between capitals, including this case Iraq and other Arab countries. Of course, Arab countries have to do it the way they think it should be done. But Jassim, I would like to go back to an Arab role, the way Arabs can solve or can contribute to solving the situation. I think this issue was debated during the last ministerial meeting of Arab foreign ministers before the summit and during the Arab summit in Riyadh itself. And we have established a common view on how we can go on helping the Iraqi people restore their independence, sovereignty, and national reconciliation. We have identified several points. We have said that to achieve national reconciliation, and here the United Nations and the Arab League, different Arab countries can do it jointly. There should be a review of the constitution because the present constitution was drafted under the well-known circumstances when Americans and others imposed their way of looking into the problems of Iraq. We think the solution of the militias in Iraq is a prerequisite for national reconciliation. The problem of Kirkuk should be solved also on the basis of national unity, where Kirkuk could be a city for all Iraqis, uniting the Iraqis, not dividing them. We think laws like the de-Baathification, other notorious laws imposed under
These
US
are
occupation should be
tall
changed.
order, Dr.
And
Faisal, and people are working on it. In the last minute left to me, I'll go to Hisham Youssef. There is a realization, perhaps there is a perception, Hisham, that certain groups within Iraq, they have somehow can be influenced by other countries. The Sunnis, perhaps they can be influenced by the Saudis and by the Jordanians, and to a lesser extent by the Syrians, while the people in power right now, the Shiites, there can be influenced by Iran. To what extent that really complicates the national reconciliation the Arab League is trying to achieve?
I have to be honest and frank about this. The Arab League cannot achieve national reconciliation in Iraq by itself. National reconciliation will only take place when there is a collective will by the international community. We can't achieve national reconciliation when we are working in one direction and have another important power working in another direction. So, and this, as a matter of fact, was one of the great benefits of the meetings that took place in Sharm el-Sheikh, because in these meetings we had all those powers that can influence the situation in Iraq. But the problem is that we can't see eye to eye and have a clear understanding of where we should go in a coherent way. And I think this is the reason why we haven't been successful in bringing Iraq out of the quagmire that it is facing at this point in time.
It is ironic, Dr. Nabil, on the beginning of the 21st century, two Arab countries are occupied, Palestine and Iraq. As somebody who suffered the occupation perhaps for the rest of your life, how do you look at this American enterprise in Iraq? Will we see the benefit of it later on, perhaps in a decade from now, 2 decades from now? Or is it a total disaster from A to Z?
Unfortunately, it's a total disaster. And I think the Americans themselves realize this more than anybody else. It has become now the basic problem afflicting their internal and external policy in every other way. So that disaster, having this disaster happen, and with it all the reverberations, including what happened to my own country and my own people, we have to really work to find an alternative. The Americans will eventually withdraw because there is no way that they can stay and make a success. They might be wise enough to start looking at real help from the Arabs and the United Nations and the Iranians and the Turks in order to withdraw and leave something behind. We have to work with the Iraqi people, and I think we have to be ready for a solution other than that imposed by the Americans. I don't think the Americans are going to stay that long.
The remedy is in the time. Dr. Nabil Shaath, Dr. Faisal Muqdad, Hisham Yusuf, gentlemen, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq. To access the show and to send us your comments, please go to aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Goodbye.